I'm Sarah. I'm 29 years old, and I used to believe that family meant unconditional love and support. For most of my life, I watched my mother move heaven and earth for my older sister Emma, justifying every sacrifice as natural maternal love. But when my mother handed Emma a check for $15,000 for her third wedding, while refusing to give me $50 for groceries during my final semester of graduate school, I started paying attention to something I'd been blind to my entire life. What I discovered about my family's financial records and the systematic way they'd been manipulating me would change everything I thought I knew about who I was in their eyes. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your family, or if you've watched a sibling receive treatment you could only dream of, this story might feel painfully familiar. And if you've ever wondered whether you're imagining the favoritism or if your feelings are valid, I want you to know that sometimes our instincts are trying to protect us from truths we're not ready to see. Growing up, I was the family's quiet achiever. While Emma was vibrant and social, bouncing from job to job and relationship to relationship, I was the one who brought home honor roll certificates and spent weekends helping my parents with household projects. My mother would smile at my report cards and tuck them into a drawer, but when Emma got promoted to assistant manager at the retail store where she worked, we celebrated with dinner at her favorite restaurant. I told myself that academic success was expected from me, while Emma's achievements were more surprising and therefore worthy of celebration. The pattern was subtle but consistent throughout our childhood and teenage years. When Emma needed a car for her junior year of high school, my parents co-signed a loan and helped with the down payment. When I needed reliable transportation for my part-time job and college applications, they suggested I save up for a used bicycle. When Emma struggled with her college courses, they hired a tutor and paid for extra study sessions. When I earned a partial scholarship and needed help with the remaining tuition, they explained that I was clearly more capable of finding alternative funding since I was so good with academics. I learned to be self-sufficient out of necessity, not choice. While Emma called home weekly to ask for help with rent, utility bills, or simply to complain about her latest romantic drama, I worked 2 jobs through college and rarely asked for anything. My parents praised my independence while simultaneously providing Emma with whatever support she needed. They seemed genuinely proud of my ability to handle things on my own, never questioning whether that burden was fair or sustainable. The first wedding happened when I was 23, and Emma was 25. She'd been dating Marcus for 8 months when she announced their engagement. My mother immediately began planning what she called the wedding of Emma's dreams. The budget was $25,000, which my parents paid entirely, explaining that they wanted to give their daughter a perfect start to married life. I was the maid of honor, responsible for organizing the bridal shower, coordinating with vendors, and managing countless details that my mother deemed too stressful for the bride herself. Emma divorced Marcus within 18 months, citing incompatibility. My mother expressed sadness about the failed marriage, but defended the wedding expense as a necessary investment in Emma's happiness. When Emma started dating Jake shortly after her divorce, my mother welcomed him enthusiastically and began hinting about future grandchildren. I was finishing my bachelor's degree and working full-time to pay for my final year, eating instant noodles most nights because groceries were a luxury I couldn't afford. The second wedding happened 2 years later. Emma and Jake had been together for 14 months when they decided to elope to Vegas. My mother was initially disappointed about missing the ceremony, but quickly pivoted to planning an elaborate reception party to celebrate their union. She spent $12,000 on what she called a proper celebration, complete with catered dinner, professional photography, and a live band. I attended the party after working a double shift at my weekend job, bringing a gift I'd saved for months to afford. Emma's second marriage lasted 2.5 years. The divorce was messier this time, involving disputes over the apartment lease and shared credit card debt. Emma moved back in with our parents temporarily, which stretched into 8 months of rent-free living while she figured out her next steps. During this period, I graduated with my bachelor's degree and was accepted into a master's program in social work. When I mentioned needing help with the security deposit for a small apartment near campus, my mother suggested I consider commuting from home, even though home was a 2-hour drive each way. I found a tiny studio apartment and worked out a payment plan with the landlord. I continued working part-time while carrying a full course load, determined to prove that I could handle graduate school without becoming a financial burden to my family. My mother occasionally commented on how impressed she was with my dedication, while Emma received care packages and surprise visits during her post-divorce recovery period. Emma met David at her job at a marketing firm where she'd started working after moving out of our parents' house. He was recently divorced himself, with 2 young children from his previous marriage. Their relationship moved quickly, and within 6 months, Emma was talking about marriage again. My mother expressed some concern about the speed of their courtship, but quickly warmed to David, especially after meeting his children and envisioning herself as a grandmother figure in their lives. By this point, I was in my 2nd year of graduate school and struggling financially more than ever. The program was demanding, limiting my work hours, and my student loan payments were piling up. I lived on rice, beans, and whatever vegetables I could afford, stretching every dollar to cover rent, utilities, and basic necessities. I developed a system of budgeting that accounted for every expense, but unexpected costs like textbooks or car repairs would throw my careful calculations into chaos. Meanwhile, Emma and David's relationship was becoming serious enough that wedding planning conversations began surfacing during family dinners. Emma mentioned wanting something more intimate this time, perhaps a destination wedding with close family and friends. My mother's eyes lit up as she began discussing possibilities and budgets. Emma laughed about being a 3-time bride, but said she finally felt like she'd found her person. I was happy for Emma's apparent contentment, but increasingly aware of the financial gulf between her experiences and mine. She lived in a nice apartment that David helped pay for, drove a reliable car, and frequently posted social media photos from restaurants and weekend trips. My own social media presence was sparse, partly because I rarely had experiences worth sharing, and partly because I was embarrassed by the stark contrast between my lifestyle and those of my peers. The breaking point came during my final semester of graduate school. I was completing my practicum at a community mental health center, working with families in crisis while managing my own financial stress. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was counseling others about healthy boundaries and self-advocacy, while accepting my family's neglect as normal. My course load was heavy, my practicum required 40 hours per week of unpaid work, and my savings had dwindled to almost nothing. I had been surviving on generic pasta and canned tomatoes for weeks when my car broke down, requiring a $300 repair that wiped out my emergency fund. With no money left for groceries and 3 weeks until my next small paycheck from weekend work, I found myself in a position I'd never experienced before, genuinely hungry with no resources left to draw from. I calculated that $50 would buy enough basic groceries to sustain me until payday, but I'd never asked my parents for money as an adult. The phone call was humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated. I explained my situation carefully, emphasizing that it was temporary and that I would pay the money back as soon as possible. My mother listened quietly, then responded that money was tight for everyone, and suggested I reach out to local food banks or churches for assistance. She mentioned that Emma and David's wedding planning was creating financial pressure for the family, and implied that my request was poorly timed. I hung up feeling smaller than I had since childhood. The suggestion to seek charity while my parents funded my sister's 3rd wedding felt like a deliberation rejection of my worth within the family structure. But I followed her advice, swallowing my pride and visiting a local food pantry where kind volunteers provided me with a week's worth of basic groceries and treated me with more dignity than my own mother had shown. 2 days later, Emma called to share exciting news about her wedding plans. She and David had decided on a small ceremony at a vineyard in Napa Valley, followed by a reception dinner for 30 guests. She bubbled with enthusiasm about the menu, the flowers, and the photographer they'd hired. Then she mentioned casually that Mom and Dad had agreed to cover the entire cost as their wedding gift, since this would hopefully be her final wedding and they wanted it to be perfect. The amount she mentioned was $15,000, excluding the cost of their own travel and accommodations. I listened to her describe dress shopping trips and tasting appointments while holding a can of generic soup that represented one of 4 meals I had planned for the remainder of the week. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that I felt like I was living in an alternate reality where my family's values and priorities had shifted beyond recognition. But something about that conversation triggered a clarity I'd never experienced before. For the first time, I began to question whether my family's treatment of me was actually normal or acceptable. I started paying attention to the specific ways they spoke about Emma's needs versus my own, tracking the financial support they provided her against the resources they claimed were unavailable when I asked for help. I began documenting what I could remember and observe. Over the course of Emma's adult life, my parents had provided her with approximately $8,000 in rent and utility assistance, $3,500 in car payments and repairs, $25,000 for her first wedding, $12,000 for her second wedding reception, and now $15,000 for her third wedding. They had also covered smaller expenses like dinners out, gifts for her various boyfriends and husbands, and regular care packages during difficult periods. In contrast, my parents had contributed $500 toward my college graduation party, which I had organized and largely paid for myself. They had never offered financial assistance for housing, transportation, education expenses, or basic necessities. They had given me birthday and Christmas gifts comparable to Emma's, but had never provided the ongoing life support that seemed to flow naturally in her direction. The financial disparity was staggering, but the emotional pattern was equally clear. Emma's problems were treated as family crises requiring immediate intervention and support. My challenges were framed as character-building opportunities that would ultimately make me stronger and more capable. Emma's achievements were celebrated enthusiastically, while mine were acknowledged briefly before conversation moved to other topics. I realized I had been unconsciously adapting to this treatment my entire life, becoming the child who didn't need attention or resources so that Emma could receive more. I had internalized the belief that my role in the family was to be self-sufficient and undemanding, never questioning whether this arrangement was fair or sustainable. The recognition was simultaneously liberating and devastating. I felt angry at my parents for the years of differential treatment and angry at myself for accepting it without question. But I also felt a growing sense of determination to change the dynamic, starting with my own response to their behavior. I decided to attend Emma's wedding with a different perspective, observing the family interactions with the analytical skills I'd developed in my social work training. What I witnessed during that weekend confirmed everything I'd begun to suspect about my position within the family system. The wedding itself was beautiful, set among rolling vineyards with perfect weather and elegant details. Emma looked radiant, and David seemed genuinely devoted to her and excited about their future together. My parents were gracious hosts, making sure every guest felt welcomed and ensuring that every detail met Emma's expectations. But I noticed things I'd previously overlooked. When other family members asked about my life and accomplishments, my parents provided brief, polite responses before redirecting attention to Emma's career success or the wedding details. When I mentioned that I was completing my master's degree, my aunt expressed surprise that she hadn't heard about my graduate studies. My mother explained that I preferred to keep my academic work private, which was entirely untrue. During the reception dinner, my father gave a toast praising Emma's resilience and David's devotion, mentioning the support and love that had sustained Emma through previous challenges. He spoke about the joy of watching their daughter find true happiness and expressed confidence in her future success. The toast was warm and heartfelt, exactly what parents should offer their child during such a significant moment. But listening to his words, I realized that he had never spoken about me with such pride or confidence, even during my own major achievements. My graduation from college had been acknowledged with a brief congratulatory comment. My acceptance into graduate school had been met with concern about the financial burden rather than celebration of the opportunity. My academic honors and awards had been treated as expected outcomes rather than remarkable accomplishments. I spent the weekend feeling like a polite stranger rather than a beloved family member. Other guests seemed to understand that Emma was the primary focus of my parents' attention and affection, treating me with the cordial distance typically reserved for distant relatives or family friends. I began to wonder how long this perception had existed and whether my parents had unconsciously communicated my lesser status to extended family and friends. The weekend also revealed the extent to which Emma had internalized her privileged position within the family structure. She expected my parents' financial and emotional support as a natural entitlement, never expressing surprise or excessive gratitude for their generosity. She made requests and assumptions about their availability and resources that I would never have considered appropriate. More troubling was her casual dismissal of my own challenges and achievements. When I mentioned the intensity of my graduate program, she responded that at least I enjoyed school, unlike normal people who found education tedious. When I described my work with families in crisis, she commented that such depressing work would drain her completely, implying that my career choice reflected some unusual tolerance for negativity rather than professional skill or dedication. The patterns I observed that weekend helped me understand that the differential treatment wasn't simply about financial resources or practical support. My parents had fundamentally different relationships with Emma and me, based on different expectations, different levels of emotional investment, and different visions of our respective futures. Emma was their beloved daughter, whose happiness and success reflected their worth as parents. I was their competent daughter, whose independence validated their parenting philosophy, but whose struggles or achievements didn't significantly impact their sense of family identity. Emma's needs were family priorities requiring collective response. My needs were personal challenges that I should handle privately to avoid burdening others. This realization was painful but also clarifying. I understood that no amount of achievement or self-improvement would change my position within the family structure, because that position wasn't based on my actions or worth. It was based on roles we'd all unconsciously accepted years earlier, roles that served everyone's needs except my own. I returned home from the wedding with a new sense of determination to change my relationship with my family, starting with my own expectations and boundaries. I had 6 weeks left in my graduate program and had already accepted a position at a nonprofit organization serving at-risk youth. My starting salary would finally provide financial stability and independence, giving me resources I'd never had to make choices about my relationships and priorities. I decided to limit my interactions with my family to occasions when I felt genuinely welcomed and valued, rather than obligated to participate in family dynamics that left me feeling diminished. I stopped calling my parents weekly to check in, instead responding when they contacted me but not initiating conversations about my life or work. The change was immediately noticeable. My parents seemed genuinely confused by my reduced availability and less forthcoming communication style. My mother called several times to ask if something was wrong, expressing concern that I seemed distant or upset about something. I assured her that I was fine but busy with finishing school and starting my career. Emma also noticed the change, mentioning during one of her calls to our parents that I seemed different lately, less interested in family events and conversations. My mother relayed this observation during one of our brief phone calls, asking if I was going through a difficult period that might benefit from family support. The irony of their sudden concern was almost amusing. After years of taking my availability and accommodation for granted, they were troubled by my slight withdrawal from their established patterns. But they approached the change as a problem to be solved, rather than an opportunity to examine the underlying relationship dynamics. I graduated from my master's program in May with highest honors and was recognized for my outstanding practicum evaluation and thesis research. The achievement represented 2 years of intense work under significant financial and personal stress, and I felt proud of what I'd accomplished despite the obstacles I'd faced. My parents attended the graduation ceremony and took me to dinner afterward, expressing appropriate congratulations and asking about my new job. But their enthusiasm felt polite, rather than genuinely celebratory, and the conversation quickly shifted to Emma's recent promotion and her excitement about starting her married life with David. I realized during that dinner that I had been hoping my academic success might finally earn the kind of recognition and pride I'd watched them lavish on Emma's more modest achievements. But their response confirmed that the issue wasn't my accomplishments or worth, it was their capacity to see and value me as fully as they saw and valued Emma. That recognition was simultaneously disappointing and liberating. I stopped seeking their approval or validation and began focusing on building a life that reflected my own values and priorities. I started my new job with enthusiasm and energy, threw myself into work that felt meaningful and important, and began developing friendships with colleagues who appreciated my skills and perspective. The financial stability of regular employment was transformative in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Being able to buy groceries without anxiety, to pay rent without complex calculations, and to handle unexpected expenses without panic gave me a sense of security I'd never experienced as an adult. I began to understand how much emotional energy I'd been devoting to basic survival and how that stress had affected my capacity for other relationships and experiences. I also began therapy to process the family dynamics I was beginning to understand more clearly. My therapist helped me recognize the ways I'd adapted to emotional neglect and financial insecurity, developing coping strategies that had served me well professionally but limited my ability to form intimate relationships and advocate for my own needs. Through therapy, I learned about family systems theory and the concept of assigned roles within dysfunctional families. The golden child receives excessive attention and resources while the scapegoat, or lost child, learns to be self-sufficient and undemanding. These roles serve the family's unconscious needs, but often prevent individual members from developing healthy relationships and self-worth. I began to see my family's dynamics as a textbook example of this dysfunction, with Emma cast as the golden child whose needs and emotions drove family decisions, while I served as the lost child whose independence allowed my parents to focus their energy and resources on Emma without guilt or conflict. Understanding these patterns intellectually was helpful, but changing my emotional responses required ongoing work. I had to learn to recognize and challenge the voice in my head that minimized my own needs while rationalizing my family's behavior. I had to practice believing that I deserved the same consideration and support they automatically provided to Emma. The real test of my changing perspective came 6 months later when Emma called to share devastating news. She and David were getting divorced after less than a year of marriage. The relationship had deteriorated rapidly after their wedding, with conflicts about parenting David's children, financial responsibilities, and long-term goals. Emma was heartbroken and angry, feeling betrayed by David's changing behavior and confused about how to rebuild her life once again. My immediate impulse was to offer comfort and practical support to help Emma navigate the emotional and logistical challenges of ending another marriage. But I paused before responding, checking in with myself about what kind of support I genuinely wanted to provide versus what I felt obligated to offer based on family expectations. I expressed sympathy for Emma's situation and offered to listen if she wanted to talk, but I didn't volunteer to manage her divorce proceedings or provide ongoing emotional support. I didn't offer financial assistance or suggest that she move in with me during the transition. I treated her crisis as I would any friend's difficult situation, with care and concern but appropriate boundaries. Emma seemed surprised by my measured response, perhaps expecting the more intensive support she'd received during previous relationship crises. She mentioned that Mom and Dad were helping her find a new apartment and covering her moving expenses, and she wondered if I might be available to help with packing and organizing her belongings. I explained that my work schedule was quite demanding, but that I might be able to help for a few hours on the weekend if she couldn't find other assistance. Emma sounded hurt by my conditional offer, pointing out that family should be the first priority during crisis situations. I acknowledged her perspective but maintained my boundaries, suggesting that she coordinate with our parents about additional support if needed. The conversation left me feeling slightly guilty, but also proud of my ability to respond authentically rather than automatically. I was still willing to help Emma within reasonable limits, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own needs and priorities to manage her crises. The shift felt significant and healthy, even though it created some tension in our relationship. My parents' response to my changed behavior was more direct. My mother called a few days after my conversation with Emma, expressing concern about what she perceived as my lack of family loyalty during a difficult time. She reminded me that Emma had always been supportive of my goals and achievements, implying that I owed her more extensive assistance during her current challenges. I listened to my mother's concerns but found myself responding with a clarity I'd never felt before. I pointed out that while Emma had been generally supportive of my goals, she had never been asked to sacrifice her own resources or priorities to help me achieve them. I mentioned that during my most difficult financial periods, Emma had been posting photos from expensive restaurants and weekend trips while I was visiting food pantries to avoid hunger. My mother seemed shocked by this information, claiming that she hadn't realized how severe my financial struggles had been during graduate school. She insisted that I should have asked for help more directly if I truly needed assistance. I reminded her that I had asked for help, specifically mentioning the phone call when I'd requested $50 for groceries and been directed to seek charity instead. The conversation grew increasingly tense as I continued to provide specific examples of the differential treatment Emma and I had received throughout our adult lives. My mother became defensive, insisting that she and my father had always tried to be fair, but that Emma and I had different needs and circumstances that required different types of support. I acknowledged that Emma and I were different people with different needs, but I challenged the assumption that Emma's needs were consistently more urgent or legitimate than mine. I pointed out that my parents had never asked whether I needed financial assistance for housing, transportation, or basic necessities, while automatically providing such support to Emma whenever she requested it. My mother's response revealed the depth of her cognitive dissonance about the family dynamics. She insisted that they had raised me to be independent and capable because they recognized my strength and resilience. Emma, she explained, was more sensitive and vulnerable, requiring additional protection and support to navigate life's challenges successfully. I realized during this conversation that my parents genuinely believed their own narrative about fair treatment, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. They had convinced themselves that providing Emma with extensive financial and emotional support while expecting me to be entirely self-sufficient represented responsive parenting rather than favoritism. But I also recognized that their beliefs about my strength and independence contained a grain of truth. I had developed resilience and resourcefulness through necessity, and those qualities had served me well professionally and personally. The problem wasn't that I was capable, it was that my capability had been used to justify neglect rather than celebrated as an achievement deserving of support. I ended the conversation by expressing love for my family while maintaining that I would no longer accept differential treatment as normal or acceptable. I explained that I wanted relationships with them based on mutual respect and consideration, not on outdated roles that served some family members at the expense of others. The following weeks brought a series of uncomfortable but necessary conversations with various family members. Emma called to express hurt and confusion about my changing behavior, insisting that she had never intended to receive preferential treatment and didn't understand why I seemed to resent her for their parents' choices. I tried to explain that my issue wasn't with Emma personally, but with the family system that had positioned us in competing roles rather than supporting us equally. I acknowledged that Emma hadn't asked to be the golden child any more than I had asked to be the lost child, but I couldn't continue participating in dynamics that diminished my own worth and well-being. Emma's response revealed how thoroughly she had internalized her privileged position within the family. She insisted that she had worked hard for everything she had achieved and deserved the support she received. She pointed out that I had always seemed to prefer independence and might have rejected help if it had been offered more frequently. The conversation helped me understand that changing my relationship with my family would require more than just setting boundaries with my parents. Emma and I had developed a dynamic based on her receiving resources and attention, while I provided support and accommodation. Changing that pattern would require both of us to develop new ways of relating to each other. But I also realized that I couldn't force Emma to examine her own role in the family dysfunction if she wasn't ready to do so. I could only control my own behavior and responses, focusing on what I needed to maintain my emotional health and self-respect. The real transformation in my family relationships began when I stopped waiting for them to recognize and address their treatment of me. Instead of hoping for acknowledgement or apologies, I focused on creating the kind of life I wanted while maintaining appropriate contact with family members who treated me with respect and consideration. My work at the nonprofit organization was incredibly fulfilling, combining my clinical skills with my passion for social justice. I was promoted to a supervisory role within 18 months and began developing programs that addressed systemic barriers facing the families we served. My colleagues respected my expertise and leadership, creating a professional environment where my contributions were valued and recognized. I also began cultivating friendships with people who shared my interests and values, building a chosen family that provided the emotional support and genuine care I'd been seeking from my biological family. These relationships helped me understand what healthy family dynamics could look like, with mutual support, appropriate boundaries, and genuine celebration of each other's achievements. The contrast between these new relationships and my family dynamics became increasingly stark. Friends who had known me for months showed more interest in my career developments and personal growth than my parents had demonstrated over years. Colleagues who barely knew my personal story treated my opinions and contributions with more respect than my family had ever shown. This recognition was painful, but also empowering. I stopped making excuses for my family's behavior and began expecting the same consideration from them that I received from friends and colleagues. When they failed to meet those expectations, I responded with appropriate consequences rather than increased accommodation. The shift became most apparent during the planning for my 30th birthday. In previous years, my birthday had been acknowledged with a card and small gift, usually overshadowed by whatever crisis or celebration was currently consuming Emma's life. But this year, I decided to plan a celebration that reflected my own preferences and priorities. I organized a dinner party at my apartment, inviting colleagues and friends who had become important parts of my life over the previous year. I planned a menu of foods I enjoyed, created a playlist of music I loved, and focused on celebrating with people who genuinely cared about my happiness and well-being. I invited my parents and Emma to join the celebration, treating them as I would any other guests rather than assuming they would play central roles in the event. My mother seemed surprised by the formal invitation and asked if I needed help with planning or preparation. I thanked her for the offer but explained that I had everything organized and was looking forward to introducing my family to my friends. The party itself was a revelation. My friends and colleagues were genuinely interested in my family's lives and asked thoughtful questions about their work and interests. But they also shared stories about my professional achievements and personal qualities that my family had never heard before. My parents learned that I had been recognized as Employee of the Month, that I had presented research at a national conference, and that my supervisors were encouraging me to pursue additional leadership opportunities. I watched my parents' expressions as they heard their colleagues describe my work with families in crisis, my innovative program development, and my reputation as a skilled and compassionate professional. They seemed surprised by the respect and admiration my friends expressed, as if they were learning about aspects of my life they had never considered. Emma also appeared caught off guard by the way my friends treated me as the guest of honor, whose preferences and happiness were the evening's primary focus. She was accustomed to being the center of attention at family gatherings, but this event clearly belonged to me and reflected my relationships and achievements rather than family obligations. The evening was exactly what I had hoped for, a celebration of the life I had built and the relationships I had cultivated based on mutual respect and genuine affection. My family members were welcomed and included, but they were not the primary focus or organizing principle of the event. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly celebrated by people who knew and valued me. After my guests left, my parents lingered to help with cleanup and expressed amazement at the warmth and enthusiasm my friends had shown. My mother commented that she hadn't realized how accomplished I had become in my work, or how many people considered me an important part of their lives. My father mentioned that my friends spoke about me with genuine affection and respect. Their observations felt like a revelation, but also a confirmation that they had never really seen me clearly before that evening. They had been so focused on Emma's more dramatic needs and experiences that they had missed the quiet way I had built a meaningful and successful life. The recognition was gratifying, but also highlighted how much they had overlooked over the years. The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion we had ever had about our family dynamics. I shared my perspective on the differential treatment Emma and I had received, providing specific examples and explaining how their choices had affected my sense of worth and belonging within the family. I didn't attack or blame them, but I was clear about the impact their behavior had had on our relationship. My parents listened with growing discomfort and occasional defensiveness, but they didn't dismiss my concerns or try to convince me that I had misinterpreted their intentions. My mother acknowledged that they had probably taken my independence and capability for granted, assuming that I didn't need the same level of support they had provided to Emma. My father admitted that they had perhaps been more responsive to Emma's requests for help because she was more direct about expressing her needs. I acknowledged their explanations while pointing out that effective parenting required them to be aware of both daughters' needs rather than waiting for explicit requests for help. I mentioned that during my most difficult periods, I had been too proud or too overwhelmed to ask for assistance, but that didn't mean I hadn't needed support. I explained that I had learned to minimize my own needs because asking for help seemed to create burden or discomfort for them. The conversation was emotionally difficult for all of us, but it felt necessary and long overdue. My parents seemed genuinely surprised by some of my experiences and expressed regret about ways they had failed to recognize my struggles or celebrate my achievements. They asked what they could do differently moving forward to rebuild our relationship on a more equitable foundation. I explained that I needed them to see and treat me as an individual with my own needs, preferences, and accomplishments, rather than as the self-sufficient daughter who didn't require attention or support. I wanted them to express genuine interest in my life and work, rather than polite acknowledgement before shifting focus to Emma's experiences. I needed them to recognize that fairness didn't mean treating Emma and me identically, but it did mean considering both of our well-being when making decisions about family resources and support. Most importantly, I needed them to understand that I was no longer willing to accept a secondary role within the family structure. I wanted relationships with them based on mutual respect and consideration, not on roles that privileged Emma's needs while minimizing my own. I was willing to work toward rebuilding our connection, but only if they were committed to genuine change rather than superficial adjustments. My parents' response was more positive than I had expected. They acknowledged that they had unconsciously favored Emma and expressed genuine remorse about the ways their choices had affected me. They asked for specific guidance about how to change their behavior and seemed committed to developing a more equitable relationship with both of their daughters. The conversation with Emma was more challenging. When I explained my perspective on our family dynamics, she initially responded with defensiveness and denial. She insisted that she had never asked for preferential treatment and couldn't be held responsible for our parents' choices about how to distribute their resources and attention. I acknowledged that Emma hadn't created the family system, but I explained that she had benefited from it while I had been diminished by it. I pointed out that maintaining the status quo would require me to continue accepting less consideration and support so that she could continue receiving more. I wasn't willing to participate in that arrangement anymore, regardless of whether she understood or approved of my decision. Emma's response revealed the depth of her investment in maintaining her privileged position within the family. She argued that she genuinely needed more support than I did because she was less naturally capable of handling life's challenges independently. She pointed out that I had always been stronger and more resilient, implying that differential treatment was actually appropriate given our different personalities and abilities. I realized during this conversation that Emma had internalized the same narrative my parents had used to justify their favoritism. She genuinely believed that she deserved additional support because she was more vulnerable, while I deserved less attention because I was more capable. The circular logic was frustrating but also illuminating. It helped me understand how the entire family had convinced themselves that unfair treatment was actually responsive parenting. I explained to Emma that strength and resilience were qualities I had developed out of necessity, not inherent traits that made me less deserving of support and consideration. I pointed out that everyone benefits from having their needs recognized and their achievements celebrated, regardless of their natural capabilities or coping skills. I told her that I was no longer willing to receive less so that she could continue receiving more. The conversation ended without resolution, but I felt proud of my ability to articulate my perspective clearly and maintain my boundaries despite Emma's attempts to convince me otherwise. I realized that changing our relationship would take time and might not be possible if Emma remained unwilling to examine her own role in the family dysfunction. Over the following months, my parents made genuine efforts to change their behavior toward me. They began calling regularly to ask about my work and personal life, expressing genuine interest in my experiences rather than perfunctory acknowledgement. They started inviting me to activities and events that reflected my interests, rather than only including me in Emma-focused gatherings. Most significantly, they began offering practical support when I faced challenges or opportunities. When my car needed major repairs, my father offered to help with the cost without my having to ask. When I was considering pursuing additional certifications for work, my mother researched programs and offered to contribute to the expenses. These gestures were small compared to the extensive support they had provided Emma over the years, but they represented a fundamental shift in how they perceived and responded to my needs. Emma's response to our parents' changing behavior was less positive. She seemed threatened by the attention and resources they were directing toward me, expressing concern that they were overcompensating for past mistakes by neglecting her current needs. She made several comments about feeling like she was being punished for receiving support she had legitimately needed and deserved. The family dynamics during this transition period were sometimes tense and uncomfortable, but they felt more honest than the artificial harmony we had maintained when I was accepting unequal treatment without complaint. We were all learning how to relate to each other in new ways, and that process inevitably involved conflict and adjustment. The real test of our changing relationships came when Emma faced another crisis. Her divorce from David had been finalized, but she was struggling with depression and financial instability in the aftermath. She had been living in a small apartment that consumed most of her income, leaving little money for other necessities or emergency expenses. When Emma's car broke down and required expensive repairs she couldn't afford, she called our parents for help as she had countless times before. But this time, my parents suggested that she explore other options before turning to them for financial assistance. They offered to help her research auto loans or find a reliable used car within her budget, but they didn't immediately offer to pay for the repairs. Emma was shocked and hurt by their response, interpreting their suggestion as rejection and abandonment during a vulnerable period. She called me to complain about their changing behavior, insisting that they were being cruel and withholding support when she genuinely needed help. I listened to Emma's concerns with sympathy, but also with a new perspective on what constituted appropriate family support. I pointed out that our parents' suggestion wasn't unreasonable. They were offering to help her find solutions rather than automatically solving the problem for her. I mentioned that this was the kind of response I had received throughout my adult life when facing financial challenges. Emma's reaction to my observation was explosive. She accused me of being vindictive and unsupportive, claiming that I was encouraging our parents to treat her badly as revenge for the preferential treatment she had received in the past. She insisted that I was being petty and cruel by not advocating for her with our parents during a genuine crisis. The conversation revealed how fundamentally different our perspectives had become about family relationships and mutual support. Emma still expected our parents to prioritize her needs and provide immediate solutions to her problems. I believed that healthy family relationships involved offering support and guidance while encouraging individual responsibility and problem-solving. I explained to Emma that I wasn't trying to punish her or encourage our parents to treat her badly. I was simply advocating for family dynamics based on equality and mutual respect rather than the hierarchical system that had privileged her while marginalizing me. I pointed out that receiving guidance and emotional support during difficulties was actually more empowering than having problems solved automatically by others. Emma's response made it clear that she wasn't ready to examine her own expectations or adapt to more equitable family relationships. She remained focused on receiving the level of support she had always expected, rather than considering whether that level of support was fair or sustainable for the family as a whole. The situation highlighted the complexity of changing long-established family patterns. My parents were making genuine efforts to treat Emma and me more equally, but Emma was experiencing their changed behavior as deprivation rather than appropriate boundary setting. She seemed unable to recognize that asking her to take more responsibility for solving her own problems wasn't cruel. It was the expectation that had been placed on me throughout my adult life. I realized that my relationship with Emma might not survive the changes I was making in my family dynamics. She had benefited significantly from the previous arrangement and seemed unwilling to accept a more equitable distribution of family resources and attention. While I felt sad about the potential loss of our relationship, I also felt clear that I couldn't continue participating in family dynamics that required me to accept less so that she could continue receiving more. My parents' evolving understanding of their previous behavior became apparent during a conversation we had about Emma's car situation. My mother expressed frustration with Emma's expectation that they would automatically solve her financial problems rather than helping her develop solutions. She mentioned that they had probably contributed to Emma's dependency by providing immediate financial assistance whenever she requested it. My father acknowledged that they had treated Emma's problems as family emergencies, requiring collective response while treating my challenges as individual responsibilities I should handle independently. He seemed genuinely surprised by the recognition that this differential response had probably contributed to both Emma's dependency and my reluctance to ask for help when I genuinely needed it. The conversation felt like a breakthrough in their understanding of how their choices had affected both of their daughters. They were beginning to recognize that protecting Emma from consequences had prevented her from developing resilience and problem-solving skills, while expecting me to handle everything independently had deprived me of support and guidance that might have been helpful. They asked for my perspective on how to respond to Emma's current situation in a way that provided appropriate support without enabling continued dependency. I suggested that they offer emotional support and practical guidance while encouraging Emma to take primary responsibility for solving her transportation problem. I pointed out that helping her research options and providing moral support was actually more valuable than simply writing a check to make the problem disappear. My parents followed my suggestion, offering to help Emma explore financing options and accompanying her to look at used cars within her budget. Emma was initially resistant to their approach, preferring the immediate solution of having her repairs paid for by them. But when it became clear that they weren't going to change their position, she reluctantly began investigating alternatives. The process of finding and financing a different car was challenging for Emma, but she ultimately succeeded in securing reliable transportation within her means. More importantly, she experienced the satisfaction of handling a difficult situation through her own efforts rather than depending on others to solve problems for her. My parents' response to Emma's success was notably different from their previous pattern. Instead of immediately moving on to the next crisis or challenge, they took time to acknowledge Emma's effort and problem-solving skills. They expressed pride in her ability to handle the situation independently and confidence in her capacity to manage future challenges. Emma's reaction to their praise was complex. She seemed pleased by their recognition, but also somewhat resentful that she had been required to work so hard for something they might have simply provided in the past. She made several comments about having to prove herself in ways that felt unnecessary and demanding. But I also noticed that Emma seemed more confident and capable after successfully handling her car situation independently. She spoke about the experience with a sense of accomplishment and mentioned feeling more prepared to handle future challenges without immediately turning to our parents for solutions. The shift in family dynamics was gradual but significant. My parents became more thoughtful about how they responded to both Emma's and my needs, offering support in ways that encouraged individual growth rather than dependency. Emma slowly began adapting to the expectation that she would take primary responsibility for her own problems while receiving appropriate guidance and emotional support. Most importantly for me, I began experiencing genuine inclusion and consideration within my family relationships. My parents started asking for my input on family decisions and expressing genuine interest in my perspectives and experiences. They remembered important events in my life and offered support during challenging periods without my having to request help. The changes weren't perfect or complete, but they represented fundamental improvements in how my family members saw and treated me. I felt valued and respected in ways I had never experienced before, while Emma gradually learned to function more independently while still receiving appropriate family support. My work continued to flourish as I channeled my personal insights about family dysfunction into more effective clinical practice. I developed expertise in working with families struggling with favoritism, emotional neglect, and unhealthy dependency patterns. My ability to recognize and address these dynamics professionally was enhanced by my own experience of changing dysfunctional family relationships. I also began speaking at conferences and training workshops about family systems therapy and the long-term effects of childhood emotional neglect. My presentations resonated with other professionals who had witnessed or experienced similar family dynamics, and I began developing a reputation as an expert in treating family dysfunction and supporting individual healing. The recognition I received professionally provided a contrast to the years of being overlooked within my own family. Colleagues and clients appreciated my insights and expertise in ways that validated my worth and contributions. The external recognition helped me maintain confidence in my own perceptions, even when family relationships remained challenging. 2 years after my 30th birthday party, I was promoted to program director at the nonprofit organization where I worked. The position involved overseeing multiple programs serving at-risk families and required skills in clinical supervision, program development, and community partnership building. My supervisor expressed confidence in my leadership abilities and mentioned that my combination of clinical expertise and personal resilience made me uniquely qualified for the role. The promotion represented professional recognition I had worked toward for years, and it provided both increased responsibility and significantly improved compensation. I felt proud of what I had accomplished despite the obstacles I had faced, and grateful for the personal growth that had enabled me to pursue my goals with confidence and determination. My parents' response to my promotion was notably different from their previous pattern of polite acknowledgement, followed by conversation about Emma's experiences. They expressed genuine excitement about my achievement and asked detailed questions about my new responsibilities and goals. They offered to take me to dinner to celebrate and suggested that we invite other family members to share in the recognition. Emma's response was more complicated, but represented growth in her ability to celebrate my achievements without making the conversation about her own experiences. She congratulated me sincerely and asked thoughtful questions about my work, though she also mentioned feeling pressure to achieve similar professional recognition in her own career. The family dinner celebrating my promotion felt like a milestone in our changing relationships. For the first time in my adult life, I was the clear focus of a family gathering, with conversations centered around my achievements and future plans rather than relegated to brief updates before shifting to other topics. My parents spoke about me with pride and confidence, treating my success as a family celebration rather than an individual accomplishment that didn't require collective attention. The evening represented everything I had hoped for in terms of family recognition and support, but it also highlighted how much I had changed during the process of advocating for myself and establishing healthier boundaries. I appreciated my family's attention and celebration, but I no longer needed their approval to feel confident about my worth and achievements. The experience of being truly seen and valued by my family was gratifying, but it was no longer the primary source of my self-worth or motivation. I had learned to validate my own experiences and accomplishments while building relationships with people who consistently treated me with respect and consideration. My family's evolving behavior was a welcome development, but it wasn't essential to my sense of identity or well-being. This shift in my relationship to family approval represented the most significant change in my personal growth journey. I had moved from desperately seeking recognition and support to appreciating it when offered while maintaining my own sense of worth regardless of their response. The transformation felt empowering and sustainable in ways that, depending on their validation, never had. Looking back on the journey from that desperate phone call asking for $50 for groceries to celebrating my promotion as program director, I'm amazed by how much has changed in my life and relationships. The woman who visited food pantries rather than burden her family with her needs had evolved into someone who expected and received appropriate consideration and support from the people who claimed to love her. The process wasn't easy or straightforward, and it required me to challenge beliefs and patterns that had shaped my identity for decades. I had to learn to recognize my own worth independent of my family's recognition, to set boundaries that sometimes created conflict, and to build new relationships that modeled healthy mutual support and consideration. But the transformation was worth every difficult conversation and uncomfortable moment of growth. I now have relationships with my family members based on genuine respect rather than assigned roles, and I've built a chosen family of friends and colleagues who consistently treat me with the consideration I deserve. Most importantly, I've learned that family dysfunction doesn't have to define our capacity for healthy relationships or personal achievement. We can recognize unfair treatment without becoming bitter, establish boundaries without cutting off love, and build new patterns of interaction that serve everyone's well-being rather than privileging some family members at the expense of others. If you're reading this and recognizing patterns of favoritism or neglect in your own family relationships, I want you to know that your perceptions and feelings are valid. You deserve consideration, support, and celebration, regardless of whether you're the family member who typically receives attention or the one who's expected to manage independently. Change is possible, but it requires courage to challenge established patterns and persistence to maintain boundaries even when others resist your growth. The people who truly love you will eventually recognize and support your efforts to create healthier relationships, while those who benefited from previous dysfunction may resist the changes you're making. Have you experienced similar patterns in your own family? Have you been the overlooked child who learned to minimize your needs, or have you watched a sibling receive treatment you wished you could experience? I'd love to hear your stories and connect with others who understand the complexity of changing family dynamics while maintaining relationships with people you love. The journey toward healthy family relationships is ongoing, but it's worth every step. You deserve to be seen, valued, and supported by the people who claim to care about you. Don't let anyone convince you that accepting less than equitable treatment is normal or necessary. Your worth isn't determined by your family's capacity to recognize it, but you have every right to expect and work toward relationships that reflect your true value. Thank you for sharing this journey with me, and remember, you are worthy of love, support, and celebration exactly as you are.